Hi, it's Steve Hargadon, and welcome to another session in the Microschool Summit. Michael Strong is here. Welcome, Michael.
Thank you, Steve. Great to be here.
So I wanted to give sort of a quick introduction to you. This long paragraph that we have on the website is probably more impressive and complex than people are ready for at this moment. But you've started many schools, some of which have done, in fact, one which was 36 best in the U.S. Can you give us a quick synopsis of your background?
Sure. So, well, actually, because it's relevant, I had a high school course where we just talked about ideas. It was philosophy. So we would read and discuss Plato, Nietzsche, Buber. I loved it. And I discovered St. John's College. We're a great book school where all you do for 4 years is talk about great books. I was going to drop out of school and go to St. John's, but instead I stayed for my senior year. I had good test scores, went to Harvard. After a year at Harvard, I left to go to St. John's because even when you have famous people talking at you, there's still people talking at you, and I hate being lectured at. After St. John's, I went to Mortimer Adler's Paideia project in Chicago while attending the University of Chicago. I was training teachers to lead Socratic seminars in inner city classrooms there. Then I got a full-time job in Alaska, training teachers to lead Socratic seminars. And that led to my first school creation project. We were on grant money, and after we ran out of grant money, some parents asked me to start a private school based on our program because they loved the Socratic seminars. And that became the Athenaeum School of Anchorage. While I was getting that going, I was recruited by a Montessori school in San Antonio, the Judson Montessori School. The Montessorians saw my Socratic as an appropriate secondary school sequel to Montessori. And so I worked there for a couple of years. I wrote a book, The Habit of Thought, and did a lot of public school in-service trainings on Socratic seminars. I was then asked to create a school for highly gifted children in South Florida. It was the Winston Academy, where we had 6th, 7th, and 8th grade students taking and passing AP exams. I then created Montessori middle schools for multi-campus Montessori organization in the San Francisco Bay Area, campuses in Palo Alto and Pleasanton. I then created a charter high school in Angel Fire, New Mexico. That's the one that was ranked the 36th best public high school in the US. At that point, I met John Mackey, the founder and CEO of Whole Foods. He and I went off and created a nonprofit to promote entrepreneurial solutions to world problems. And about 10 years ago, I moved back to Austin and created another school, KoSchool, with a man named Kozo Cabelli, who's unfortunately now gone. And that was combining the kind of Socratic with a project-based focus. Eventually, that was basically swallowed up by my next position, where I created the high school model for the largest Montessori network in the US, higher ground education. We had high schools in San Francisco, New York, Austin, and St. Louis, and they had over 100 Montessori schools. And all of that led to, in summer of 2020, when I saw COVID was not going to return things to normal, I took all of my experience and created the Socratic experience with 3 students in the fall of 2020 as a virtual school, middle school only that year. This year, fall of 2021, we added grades 3 through 5 and 9 through 12. So now we're a grade 3 through 12 virtual program with about 100 students. So that's a super quick run through. So.
Pretty amazing. I'd forgotten the John Mackey connection, but thank you for reminding me of that and us of that. Do you consider your school a micro school? It's not really a micro school, is it?
So I would say most of my schools have been micro schools in the sense of small. A lot of times, one characterization I would say is that, I got to the point where I can go to just any town and, with enough people and talk 10 to 20 parents into putting money down up front and start a school from scratch. So most of my schools started between 10 and 20 students. This one started at 3. Since it's virtual, we can scale arbitrarily. So this current one would no longer be a micro school just because virtual allows scale. But all my brick and mortar schools were small.
Well, I want to let you kind of tell your story and share with us your experiences, but I am interested in one particular question as we start. right? Because in the opening keynote, we talked about the fact that just being a small school or micro school doesn't necessarily mean that you follow a particular pedagogy or view of how learning takes place. And my guess is that you and Prenda would do things a little bit differently. So in what way does small size facilitate certain kind of pedagogies, and in what ways do we need to recognize that there are actually differences in pedagogy, even with small size?
Well, great question. I would say to start with, obviously technology has made it easier to personalize. One thing with a small school is you're almost always going to get, a range of students, typically different ages, different grades, different ability levels, and the radical heterogeneity means that, or in my experience, at least, you have to personalize everything. The standard school model is you've got a third grade class, you're doing the same curriculum for all the third graders. You've got a seventh grade class, you're doing it for all seventh graders. And then especially in something like math, it just allows us to keep track of, when I created Montessori middle schools in Palo Alto, I had 30 middle school students, grades 6 through 8, with everywhere from grade 3 mathematics for a student with learning differences to a student doing pre-calc in 8th grade. And just that kind of radical heterogeneity with respect to math levels is only possible with, with software. So I'm sure different schools do things very differently. For me, the Socratic piece is great because it automatically personalizes. We can ask questions and different students address those at different levels. I find it easy to personalize writing. But for me, the key thing is small, you're focused on the kids rather than kind of the curriculum dominating. That's my perception.
Good. Well, how would you like to proceed?
Well, I could tell endless stories. I've got lots of battle scars and lots of battle stories. So I'd happy to go into any of those. But since we've got a small group, given I've created so many schools in so many different contexts, is there any particular question or story anyone would like me to dive into?
I personally think it might be really interesting to hear you give your perspective on this moment in time, whether or not we should be optimistic, or are these just waves of kind of change? And as you described, the grammar of schooling and why school reform is impossible. And then maybe for those who are new, probably people watching the recording rather than being here live, but for those who are sort of new to the concept, have you learned some things that you would say, I can save you a lot of time by telling you about a few things that happened to me that would make a difference if you are thinking of starting a small school?
The latter question is a hard one. Lots of things come up, but just to start with, I think a lot of people wonder. I'll be harsh. My personal perception is that regular school is just horrible. For me, I was in allegedly good public schools 50 years. How long? 40 years ago. But it was boring. Secondary school was boring and often cruel. And so I think a lot of people wonder, why is school the way it is? And then many of us go off and start schools or try to start schools. And when you're tiny, it's hard. First of all, it's just really hard. I would say, as a generalization, even though I've done it over and over again, and every year, the first year was brutal, just brutal. And my wife says she's never going to allow me to start another brick and mortar school. And part of this is, no matter what you dream up on paper, once you have real human bodies, every teacher or guide comes in with their understanding and expectation. Every family comes in with their expectation. And it just takes a while to get everything moving in the same direction in some sense. The second year is usually rough, but better. You kind of have some systems in place and some alignment and kind of know where you're going. And then often the third year is when it starts to get easier. So I would say, first off, try to make it through those first 3 years, do everything you can to have great support systems, and especially the first 2 years. But part of it is this, what Steve refers to as the grammar of schooling. Most people have expectations that what school looks like is there is a 3rd grade math curriculum that you must go through before you go through the 4th grade math curriculum. There's a 7th grade history curriculum. And these are what grades look like, and this is how you evaluate students, and this is what it means to teach, and this is what it means to learn. There's a question I've had for decades was, why is there so little innovation in the private sector? The fact is, most private schools look pretty much like public schools. Maybe they have slightly smaller classes, maybe have fancier gymnasiums and swimming pools and theaters and whatnot. But most private schools are remarkably similar. I'm especially interested in the Montessori and Waldorf movements because they've had quite different systems for 100 years now. Sudbury Valley has had quite a different system for maybe 40, 50 years now. More recently, Acton and Prinda and all these other things. But what I finally came to is the reason most private schools do not try to escape the box is because all of the systems are for the box. If you want, a math curriculum or a math assessment or a history curriculum, history assessment, it's designed for the standard system. Software, if you want a student information system, the student information system asks, what grade is your child in? And what are the, how are you going to assign grades and everything? And so I've sometimes called it the standard operating system of school is a larger monopoly than Microsoft ever had. And so if you want to step out of either the operating system of school or the grammar of schooling, all of a sudden on the plus side, you have this opportunity to meet the real needs of children directly and families, kind of without the intervention of, I would say, all of the garbage that controls us. But on the other hand, you have to make everything up. I think it's exciting that somebody like Prinda is at scale now with their own version. But when you're starting, and Acton has done its own version of kind of your own version, but most of my schools, I kind of had to make it up. And, I had the Socratic thing for a long time and the math thing for a long time, but there are always pieces where I'm, doing it kind of ad hoc, where do I grab this and not fall into the system? Thank you. Global Education Reform Movement. Yeah, but I would say that's the biggest thing is that there is this system, we step out of it. It's hard. A lot of times sometimes people perceive Montessori and Waldorf to be a little bit cult-like and dogmatic. I think a lot of it is if you're pulling away from the system, you're kind of in this defensive posture. And just to talk a little bit about parent expectations. So, I want young people to be confident, to own their own education, to be responsible for it, to love learning, all of these wonderful things we talk about. And yet parents, even if your child is confident and learning and happy, they wonder, are you teaching the 7th grade standards? So I'll give you one anecdote. When I was doing, the Winston Academy, where we actually had middle school students passing AP tests, I was telling a parent, your son can pass AP biology in 7th grade, which is amazing. And their response is, but won't he miss the 7th grade science curriculum? And, bless them. But if your child is passing AP biology in 7th grade, the 7th grade science curriculum just doesn't matter. But everybody has been programmed, or many parents have been programmed to believe that all of that stuff matters. I talk to homeschool, alt school families who say, don't they have to take the standards credits in high school? And I explain, look, when I went to Harvard, there was a kid who was elected mayor of a small town in Michigan at the age of 18. He had low SAT scores. Harvard doesn't care. If you can get yourself elected mayor at 18, they don't care. I just had an intern who got into Harvard, and he was pretty much unschooled, but he was a professional actor for 2 years. So you're, professional actor doing AMC series with Pierce Brosnan. They don't care what credits you got in high school. I knew a girl who got into MIT at 14. Her transcript was a handwritten note of the books she'd read and the science courses she'd audited, but she was working with a world-class researcher at UCSF. So what people don't realize is, and Steve, I want you to write and speak about this more, is that you don't need the system. Then going back to why I'm optimistic, despite the grammar of schooling, is I think I'm encountering more people who realize you don't need the system. For me, it's really a case of the emperor has no clothes. The system has from my perspective, the system has no independent credibility, validity. It's just this big bureaucratic thing that has kind of grown like a cancer over the last 150 years. And, personally, I'm ready to just leave it behind, de-school society and get into real learning. But for decades, I've been kind of on the bleeding edge, and I'm hoping that I'm only on the cutting edge, not quite the bleeding edge now, because there are more and more people that realize the system has no credibility. So that was kind of a rambling answer, Steve. Which piece do you want me to expand on or jump into?
Clarity. And I think thanks to Joe, I think we're talking about Montessori school sometimes being guilty of choosing imitation over innovation. And so maybe part of what we see is the temptation to replace one system with another system. We have the sense that we're going to replace a system with a better system, rather than replacing a system with a process. And I guess that's so interesting to me, right? Because the question would be, what would the conditions be that you would need to create for people to go through the process of thinking deeply about teaching and learning for their kids, and then creating solutions locally? And that's sort of fascinating to me, right? That and my guess is Socratic learning really picks up on that, right?
Absolutely. And actually, just to address that, I mean, Scott Buchanan, who is the architect of the St. John's program, has a quotation to the fact that if I know what I know and I know what I don't know, then I know what I need to know, and I can become my own best teacher, my own best authority, and so forth and so on. And whether it's at a micro level of when I'm reading a text, I highlight makes sense. This part of the world seems to make sense. What do I need to clarify in my own mind so that that makes sense? For me, there's sort of a Socratic algorithm constantly going in my head, which is understanding the world, and what do I need to do to understand the world? But even there, Steve, when I say understanding the world is my goal as a learner, many people do not understand that to be the goal of education. And to be fair, if I wanted to be good at carpentry, I'm terrible at carpentry. It would not be understanding the world, it would be learning how to do certain things. And so even though understanding is my personal goal and what I'm most passionate about, there are lots of legitimate kinds of education that have different goals. So I think a lot of this is, and a lot of times when I talk to prospective families, a big part of what I want to do is get clarity on what are your goals? Is lifelong happiness a goal? Is selective college admissions goal? Is athletic championship a goal? Is learning mathematics goal? What is your goal? Because I think we cannot define education unless we know where we're going. And you can't even create a micro school if people are going in different directions. I would say a lot of the small schools that I've seen failed because everybody thought they were on the same page with a vision. And then they get together on a year 2 or 3, they realize, no, they're in different directions and it falls apart. So to be a bit more sympathetic with Montessori, replace a system with a system. If you don't have some kind of coherent vision, I think it's very confusing for students, families, and faculty.
And visions are recreated, right? They have to be kind of rebuilt every generation. So it's not. I mean, I was thinking about Brenda, thinking about, well, this is really terrific material, and it's going to have to be reinvented every generation in order for it to still have power.
Absolutely. I mean, I like to anchor things on lifelong happiness and well-being. My goal as an educator is lifelong happiness and well-being. And what does that mean 10 years from now? Yeah, it'll be different. I also use the bliss diagram, the intersection of what do you love, what are you good at, what does the world need, and what will the world pay for? And again, certainly what the world needs and what the world will pay for are going to change constantly. And so all of it, and what you're good at, with AI and robots taking over jobs, what you are good at is going to morph over time as well. I'm sure what you love will morph over time.
Great. Well, let's open this up. If you have a question for Michael, please feel free to put it in the chat, or if you have a comment, we can give you the microphone. So I often use the analogy of the food system. That, like, if I go to a particular city, they may have a really robust ecosystem of small restaurants with lots of interesting food. That there's a large industrial food system, and then you get something like Whole Foods and Fresh Market, or not Fresh Market, natural grocers, or some of these other chains that come in and they create a solid alternative that theoretically is a sort of a higher level of thinking about food. So is that the likely outcome for education, that there will always be a big system, but then you're hoping to have good, solid narratives that people can discover?
So I love the food metaphor. I'm going to kind of skew it in a little bit of a different direction and then come back to yours. One is just the diversity of food. So we often think about it, there are grocery stores, there are restaurants, there are fast food, there are high-end restaurants, there are organic restaurants. There are different kinds of grocery stores, and of course, different kinds of diets and everything. So I do think one of the things I'm most impressed with is the plurality of pathways. Again, when I was younger, I was a bit more dogmatic. This is the one right way. But if I can imagine a family with 10 kids, sending them to 10 different schools. But I do think that with freedom from the system, we'll see a lot more different ways to help your child become happy and well. And, just in terms of personalizing, there's some boys who are just so physical. Certainly as a virtual school, I can't serve a very, very physical boy. He needs to be out there doing things. And there's some people who are brilliant musicians, and I can't serve them. They need an education which is maybe anchored in their musical experience that can have lots of other things. A category that I think is remarkably empty is, as an adult, I'm very aware of how important sales is. People who are great at sales and marketing, they're the ones who help companies become profitable or not. If you can't sell or market, there's nothing there. And yet our school system doesn't reward. Some people are great talkers. Some kids are just, man, they could sell me anything. And unless they happen to be good at Algebra 1, they don't get validated at all. And so, in some ways, I'm struck by, what will the system ultimately look like? I think it will be more diverse than we can imagine. I mean, literally more diverse than we can imagine. Give you kind of a couple of other strange examples. I'm not very good at humor. Often I appreciate most what I'm not good at. There are people that are just so brilliant at easing the tension in a situation with humor and warmth and changing the whole atmosphere in a room. And I thought, what if we had schools that reliably resulted in people who were brilliant at using humor? What does that look like? I don't know, but when I think of the diversity of skills and talents and geniuses, I like to talk about a world of 7 billion geniuses. There are so many different ways to be an amazing human. And when I think, I would say, we micro schools, we need to be kind of academic, to some extent. But when I think of all the different ways of being an amazing human being is actually valuable in the world. Different example is, I always think of, what if you had Robin Williams as a student in your class? He was probably jumping on the desk, under the desk, over the desk. He'd get in trouble in almost any school system, and yet Robin Williams is brilliant. So I'm very into encouraging people to kind of push the boundaries of what might be considered school, because I think the more I try to personalize an education for every child, I think, wow, I just can't serve that one, and I can't serve that one. And my faculty and I are exhausted trying to personalize these things for these kids. So I'll pause with that rant.
So my youngest daughter took AP World History, and it was kicking her butt. And so I read the textbook with her every night. And I came away from that class sort of shocked by the degree to which the history of the world was a history of power and control. That we people like you and me like to think up here in this sort of high philosophical level, but there were, really strong incentives for power and control that defined a lot of historical eras. And so I wonder if we sometimes underestimate the degree to which school is a form of power and control, modern public schooling. So I can say that I want schooling to be like food with the variety and all the little restaurants, but am I underestimating the degree to which there are power structures that depend on how schools operate?
So big time. And I want to acknowledge, I also want to get to Caleb has a great question in the chat, but just on that point, my hopeful end run there is that I call it the mama bear revolution, that yes, there are a lot of different parties interested in power and control of education, for sure. And yet, not to pick on dads, but when I talk to a mama bear whose child is not thriving, and I validate her perception her child should be thriving, I see that as a force that can do everything. And so I would say part of my mission is to validate parents' perceptions that their children are not thriving. They should. Their child deserves to thrive. It sounds like such a banal, obvious message, but a lot of parents like, you mean it's okay to believe my child should be thriving? Yes, please, and don't stop, fighting the system. Until every child's thriving. There's an organization in Arizona called Love Your School, which I just love the title. Every human being should love their school, and until we get there, I'm not satisfied. But to answer Caleb's question, he asks, when you're focusing on a system that's unique to you and your learners, what does the dialogue sound like when current parents or prospective parents ask about learning accountability in regard to what students are learning? I think that's a great question, Caleb. And my basic strategy is to focus on skills rather than content. So reading, writing, math, and our simple brand promise is grade level or better, unless there is an explicit agreement with parents. And what that does is I do get a lot of students with learning differences, or sometimes parents are pretty unschooly and don't care. So we can always be flexible there, but just to give parents some confidence. And basically with the vast majority of kids, I find grade level reading, writing, math is just not hard. The other thing I do is, especially in secondary school, we focus on post-high school destinations. So if college bound, then we focus on great SAT scores, a couple of great college courses, and great projects. Great projects gives us radical freedom. And if they're not college bound, then we have art school, film school, design school, because for those sorts of programs, a portfolio is more important. So basically, to kind of attack this monster of learning accountability, instead of worrying about the third grade history curriculum or whatever, I want to have absolute freedom to explore history, science, social studies, art, music, everything. Reading, writing, math, pretty easy usually to be on grade level. And then with college, we're very focused on do what we need to do to get them to the college they want, but do not do more. So if they only have to take 3, maybe 4 college courses before they are done with high school, that gives me a ton of freedom. So I'm all about sort of anchors of accountability that give parents confidence that we're going somewhere, huge flexibility around that, and encourage them to see that, and this is actually why the college admissions piece is important, that if your child is amazing at something, we can get them into a great college. And it doesn't have to be 15 AP courses. That's simply ridiculous. So
Thank
hopefully
you.
Go ahead.
Go, Caleb.
I was saying thank you. I truly appreciate that. I work with, my school is a middle school, so we're not solely focused on post-secondary, but I can definitely take the advice that you gave about pretty much passion-based learning.
Well, thank you. And I would say the other thing is I'm a big believer in reading and writing. And if you make writing fun and enjoyable, I think it's easy to do better than standard public schools in terms of getting kids to write. Get them talking and passionate and excited, and lots of personal coaching. The reading and writing can be easy to blow the regular schools away. But I'm glad it was helpful, Caleb. Feel free to reach out if you need more help. Tom Bogle asks, how do you think we go about recruiting, persuading people with skills atypical to school environments to consider how they can use their skills to educate K-12 kids? I mean, that's a great question. And to some extent, I have inbound inquiries from people, teachers wanting to teach with me all the time. So I don't have to recruit or persuade people. Some of this is if you know that you don't have to have a standard credential, and if people know that teaching can be joyful. And I would say the other huge advantage we have is even if a micro school is exhausting, I think the environment is typically a lot more enjoyable and nurturing than our standard teaching positions. And so I encourage people to, think about, if you want to share your expertise, just make it clear that we value diverse kinds of expertise, that I mean, I'm very blunt. I say I don't believe in credentials. I actually say that if somebody sends me a cover letter that starts, I'm certified to teach blah, 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 and blah, 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 I throw it in the trash. I'm kind of aggressively anti-credential, anti-system. But part of what that does is, what I also say is I want people around, I want people teaching kids who are people I would want my children around as a parent. And who is that? That means a decent, interesting human being who's eager to share their expertise with kids. Doesn't mean they've ever taken an education class or anything like that. So, in my experience, once people know you don't have to jump through all the hoops, there are a lot of wonderful people eager to work with young people.
Michael, Mara Leinenberger spends a lot of time with her micro school clients talking about the difficulty of financial expectations, and that you can't be sustainable if you don't actually charge enough to run the school. And once you're successful, you can offer scholarships and other things. But how do you approach this, and what do you think about this, sort of the financial side of this?
I would say that is a really hard problem. And I would say, especially with tiny schools, it's really hard to stay afloat financially. In my experience, it becomes easier to be in the black when you get to, say, 60, 70, 80 students. Really tiny schools are hard. One of my basic philosophies around it, though, is to charge, to charge a high tuition. I'll give you an example. 20 years ago, when I was doing Montessori middle schools in Palo Alto, our tuition was $18,000. Then that's probably, with inflation, 25, 30 today. But then, and we'd have parents complain, but then these parents would show up in, a $100,000 car, their house would be worth $3 million, and they're complaining about spending $18,000 on their kids. And so part of my attitude is the parents, and the other thing is parents who can pay will pay whatever. If parents can afford it, they will pay whatever. So I'd rather have a high list price on tuition and then, give discounts. I do give discounts for just amazing kids. Part of it is in a small environment, the quality of the child, and it sounds like a mean thing to say, but there are some children who just raise the quality of the environment so much. They up the expectations for everyone else. And so I'm happy to give, as it were, merit scholarships for children who transform the environment in a positive way. And so often when my schools are small, we have pretty high tuition for the parents who can pay. And then we have a few scholarships, but they're for kids who, I would say, transform the environment is the expression I would use. Because a lot of what matters in a small school is the environment. Parents are leaving the system, public and private, because there's something they don't like there. And often it's as much about the social environment as it is about the academics. And so, I'm all about how can we sort of carefully curate this wonderful human experience and get people who can pay to pay what they can pay.
So if you have a question for Michael, you can put it in the chat. Michael, what about all of the skills that typically aren't part of what we consider the academic experience, but would be part of becoming a competent adult? The kinds of things that often would occur in a family rather than in a school setting.
Great question. So one of the things, Jeff Weiner, CEO of LinkedIn, has said the soft skills gap is the greatest skills gap in the 21st century. Everybody talks about coding and technology and so forth. I think there's a compelling case that, and soft skills is a terrible term. We need a better term. But I would say being an effective, caring human who can communicate well is absolutely invaluable. And one of the great things actually about being a micro school is it's all about, you're small enough you can have real human relationships. I would actually say a huge priority to make this effective is to find time for your faculty to meet without students around, because a lot of what I do in the faculty meetings at all of my schools is, we talk through what's going on with respect to the culture. I actually regard education as largely the creation of subcultures. And so a lot of what we do is we talk about what's going on in the culture of the classroom or the community in order to help elevate and refine it and help the students be more decent, thoughtful, respectful, greater ownership of themselves and the communities. And, you can use things like, rubrics and so forth. I'm actually not big on as it were, lessons in this. One of my pet peeves about both character education and social emotional learning is it's 95% lessons. Somebody designs something to tell students this is how they should behave. And for me, no. It's about in real time, intervening in a relationship situation, or calling attention to something, or praising a student for this wonderful act of initiative or kindness or generosity. And so if your faculty are aligned about the virtues, I'm unabashed about, let's talk about virtue culture, and we're creating a micro virtue culture. If the faculty are aligned and the students see that these things are honored in the community, I think it's possible to create these micro communities that are just beautiful. I think they're beautiful human communities. And it's not about, lessons in pedagogy. It's about we as real living flesh and blood human beings share a vision of what it means to be a decent human being. And we talk about it and we manifest it and we address it when it doesn't go well. So I could rant for a long way on that one, but did that make sense?
Absolutely. And I'm reminded of the fact that when I talk to people about their school experiences, they will almost always say, I had a great teacher who did X, Y, or Z. There was someone who took an interest in them or care that was a very high touch human interaction that changed their lives. So my guess is that you're trying to figure that out as well.
Huge. And just to kind of flip it around, in terms of marketing, the CDC has research showing that almost all adolescent dysfunction is due to a lack of family connection and or lack of school connection. Basically, if kids are well connected, meaning they have healthy relationships both at home and at school, they're less likely to be anxious, depressed, suicidal, substance abuse, cutting, self-harm, anorexia, pregnancy, violence, you name it. If they're not connected at school and home, they're much more vulnerable, which makes sense. We are as absolutely transformative to adolescent well-being and ultimately to adult well-being. Sometimes, if we wanted to get into how silly the world is, sometimes it's like these middle schoolers have not developed. But if we could help, all young people develop into more mature, thoughtful beings, our world would be different. And so one of the ways I sell these educations is to get people to understand the urgency of, this is why validating the child's need to flourish, their child needs to be thriving. And sadly, I've seen kids who, on the one hand, when they came to one of my schools, they used to be anxious, depressed, suicidal, etc. In a few weeks, months, drop the meds, healthy, happy, well. And conversely, I've seen kids who did not leave a toxic environment and truly horrific things have happened to them. And so for me, this is a public health emergency of the highest order. And I would say that insofar as we are creating healthy human communities for teens, we're doing some of the most important public health work in the United States and the world.
Do you see Joe's question there?
Let me see. So thank you, Joe. What do a virtual school to create a sense of community? That's terrific question. So a couple of things. One is we actually do spend time virtually in communities. We have explicit time just to connect with absolutely no academic agenda. It is led by a guide, so it doesn't become inappropriate. But we give time online where we, on Zoom, laugh, talk, joke, current events, books, movies, games, what you doing, what's going on. We have some hangout time that's very explicit. Then we also, everything is conversation. So personal growth is a conversation where the kids are talking about how to be their best selves, but it's also a way to form intimacy and authenticity. Socratic is all talk about ideas, what we believe, the true, the good, and the noble. Our math problem solving is interactive. So basically our kids are connected by conversation all day long. They also we have a Slack channel that allows them to communicate asynchronously. But of course, what they did is they created a Discord channel where we have no access to it, no control over it. But they're on Discord together 24/7, talking about games and study groups and arguing about Ukraine and politics. And they have their whole world over there. So they're very connected. They have very close relationships. And partly that's our program, and it's partly these explicit things we do. And yes, Katie, connection satiates the primary need of the brain that allows us to learn. This I know one of the reasons that I want more parents to realize the dangers is that they value what we do. I think a lot of times parents send their kids to micro schools, but there's this anxiety that they're missing something over there. And one of the reasons I like to peg what we do to grade level reading, writing, math, or above is to alleviate that anxiety. My sense of selling these programs is that if we can make the parents feel safe that their child is going to be academically at grade level or above, and then we talk about the creativity, the warmth, the community, the connection, the well-being, then they can hear it. But if we don't, I've known some alternative educators who are like, we let the kids do whatever, and parents like freak out and run for the hills. You know, I think that most parents need something to hang on to. This is a leap of faith for them. And so I want to reassure them that we're working with them to do amazing things, help their child do amazing things. Thank you, Katie. Go ahead.
Do you, or have you seen anybody do work with helping parents and being better parents and more comfortable in their families?
Huge. I would say pretty much every school I've been at, parent education has been a thing. What's tricky is if it comes across as a sort of scolding, you know, a lot of times faculty are like, I wish parents, you know, it never helps to scold. So I always want to make it more about how we can be helpful, how we can help you connect with your child more effectively. You know, and a lot of this is helping them to understand that supporting their child's individuality and individuation can lead to their child being successful. I think a lot of parents, you know, many parents do have a control thing and a fear thing. And so a lot of what I do in communicating with parents is, you know, simply explaining these multiple pathways to a great life. You know, I think all these schools, certainly all of my schools, we tend to get people who have not been successful elsewhere. And so the number, this is why you don't need to worry. This is how you can support them. This is how you create a shared vision and help, in many cases, help broaden their vision of what it means to have a great life in the 21st century. And it can include academic success. But again, part of this is getting them out of the straitjacket of conventional expectations. And just the stories. I had a webinar called When School's Not Working, where I interviewed many of these people who have alternative success stories. And just for them to hear real human beings. I live in a world where I probably know hundreds of people who went alternative paths and have had great lives. Many parents have never met one. And so when I say, hey, you don't need to do standard 7th grade science, they're like, you're crazy. But, you know, if I show them, you know, these 50 people, half of whom have gone to Ivy League schools without doing 7th grade science, they're like, what, really? And so a lot of this is expanding their definition of what's possible. And then they can, again, appreciate the warmth, the care, the nurturing, all of that.
Michael, thank you.
You are most welcome. I'm delighted that this community exists. I'm delighted more communities exist. Yeah, feel free to reach out. I'm super passionate. I believe what we're doing is saving the world, and you know, anything that I can do to help us all, you know, transcend the system and help meet the needs of young people more effectively. I'm all in.
Howdy.
Really appreciate it. I'm going to jump into the final closing keynote. I hope you'll join us for what should be a very interesting conversation. Thanks, Michael. Thanks, everybody, for being a part of this.
Thanks. Bye-bye. Okay,